Welcome to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast, where we cut through the noise and help you make sense of the chaotic information space around us. I'm Griff Somke. January 6, 2025 is the fourth anniversary of the 2021 insurrection, which saw the supporters of Donald Trump storm the United States Capitol, leaving at least 5 dead, over 1,000 people criminally charged, $2.6 billion in damages, and the country forever changed. Journalist Teddy Wilson from Radical Reports has been covering the aftermath since the day's events, and on the eve of the return of Donald Trump to the presidency, he has a new article about the retribution being planned by the upcoming administration. He joins me on the Did Nothing Wrong podcast today to discuss it. Stick around.
This is a crusade. This is a holy war against the deep state.
Where are the dictators? Where are the strong men?
Donald Trump is our instrument for retribution.
I'm going to fight for Christians. I'm going to fight for white people.
They have the Great Reset. We have the Great Awakening.
And why shouldn't I root for Russia? Because I am.
I want to see these people go through misery because of their grooming against our children.
After the assailant entered the home asking, "Where's Nancy? Where's Nancy?" Those are the very same words used by the mob when they stormed the United States Capitol.
I did nothing wrong.
Teddy, welcome back to Did Nothing Wrong. It's great to have you on again.
Yeah, it's great to join you again. It's a real pleasure to get to be on the podcast once again.
We always appreciate having you. You've got a new piece out in your newsletter, Radical Reports, about the increasingly likely prospect that Trump pardons the people that have been convicted of crimes related to their involvement in the January 6th insurrection. What do you think the chances actually are that he does this?
Well, I think it's a relatively high likelihood that President-elect Donald Trump pardons at least a significant portion of the roughly 1,500 people that have been arrested or charged or convicted for their actions on January 6, 2021. I think the real question is how many of those people that he pardons and under what circumstances, if they have been convicted, what crimes they have been convicted or charged of, how many of those people he pardons. Because that seems to be kind of the dividing line within the Republican Party and within certain portions of Trump supporters, is kind of not necessarily whether or not he's going to pardon any of them, it's how many and which ones.
Right. What do you think the odds are that he pardons everybody? Just blanket pardon. If you were involved in this and you've been convicted, you are now pardoned. Go forth.
Well, I think there's a non-zero chance that he blanket pardons the January 6th defendants. I think there are probably some potential legal challenges, or there's areas in which they will have to kind of consider how they write a blanket pardon.
Right.
Right, because the criminal investigations have been ongoing, and there are still people being arrested and charged for January 6th.
Right.
And so I think if he were to issue a blanket pardon, it would probably have to be worded in a way in which it isn't just people that have been charged and convicted. It would probably have to be even broader than that. Anyone that participated or who has been investigated, or whatever wording they might choose, that might be actually how they would have to write a blanket pardon.
Right.
Although I'm not a lawyer, or a constitutional scholar, so I can't speak to real specifics about that, but that would be my speculation on how that might happen.
You mentioned in the piece that Dean Jackson, who's a consultant who worked for the January 6th committee, told you that if President-elect Trump were to pardon all of the Capitol riot defendants, it would be a, quote, disaster, unquote, because many leaders of the far-right extremist groups would have the, quote, determination to remobilize and the ability to capitalize, unquote, on their newfound freedom. What do you see happening if, say, he decides to pardon Stuart Rhodes from the Oath Keepers or Enrique Tarrio from the Proud Boys, both of whom were convicted of the big boy crime of seditious conspiracy and are serving many years?
Yeah, I think that is probably the real terrifying prospect of this, is that if Trump does provide pardons to the leaders of the various extremist groups that not only participated but organized the assault on the U.S. Capitol,
Yeah.
that there is all indications that those leaders would kind of rejoin the far right movement and continue to organize again, and they would also come back into the movement with essentially a tremendous amount of street cred, right?
Oh, yeah. A conquering hero. They did their time. They got busted. They went down for Trump. They didn't testify. And now they're back out. And yeah, that's bad.
Yeah, and I think it would depend on kind of each individual leader on what that might look like because of, internal far right kind of politics, basically, and kind of how these groups have evolved post January 6th.
Right, right.
You have some groups, the Proud Boys, that have actually kind of, in many ways, I think, grown and flourished since January 6th. They have become much more decentralized. They don't have the same kind of national structure that they did. And so it would be interesting to see where someone like Enrique Tarrio fits within kind of the new mold of the Proud Boys.
Right.
And then someone like Stuart Rhodes, who would be coming out to where the Oath Keepers have basically ceased to exist as an organization.
Yeah.
There are a few chapters that have remained operational, but even those chapters, many of them have kind of rebranded.
Right.
And so it would be interesting to see whether or not he tries to kind of reboot the Oath Keepers or if he joins the far right movement in kind of some other form or fashion. But either way, you would have dozens of these people that have been convicted of serious crime who would filter back into the kind of organizing and kind of extremism space.
Right. And kicking a couple of very charismatic leadership figures back into the wild is definitely not going to help when it comes to the cause of clamping down on violent far-right organizing. We had Dakota Adams on the podcast not too long ago. That's the son of Stuart Rhodes. And he talked about growing up with Stuart as his dad. And he said kind of Stuart's one core skill is being able to get these right-wingers to follow him. He's like a born leader when it comes to this certain kind of mentality. He's not really good at anything else in life. He's kind of a failure in a lot of other ways, but he's very good at getting these people to rally around him as a far-right leadership figure. So you got to figure that's the first thing he would probably do if you let him out, is put some kind of new group together and go into that, which would be just, I think, catastrophic at this point, especially looking at 4 years of a upcoming Trump administration. You also raised the possibility of Trump deciding to persecute the people who worked on those cases, such as committee staff, and in some cases, members of the January 6th committee themselves. He's made noises about prosecuting people like Adam Schiff and Liz Cheney. And this is unprecedented, just like a lot of what's gone on since 2015, but I don't really doubt that he may try it. You mentioned in the piece that you are seeing some very chilling effects on future efforts to hold people accountable for this kind of thing as a result. Can you tell us about that?
Right. So with respect to the January 6th committee specifically, you have a committee that is formed of a bipartisan members of both the House and the Senate that does this really thorough, exhaustive investigation of what happened on January 6th, who were the people involved, how was it organized, what was the planning that led up to it, and who were the people that were peripherally involved, right? It was a very comprehensive investigation, and it included dozens of staff members
Right.
who came on to the committee to do a variety of different types of investigative work, from interviewing the leaders and participants in the January 6th Capitol riot to conducting forensics investigations of social media and other places online. And I think when you have this looming threat that is coming from not just Donald Trump himself, but also potential members of his administration and other far right supporters of his, I think it really does create a very chilling effect for anyone that wants to conduct a similar investigation in the future and hold people accountable in government. If they have this looming threat that the people that they're investigating, if they ever come back into power, would use the levers of government against them and persecute them.
Right.
So it has been really, I think, interesting and terrifying to kind of see the effect that this is having on people.
Yeah, from the fact that, like you said, almost nobody wanted to go on the record about this, it definitely sounds like the people involved are taking this threat very seriously. But besides a presidential pardon from the outgoing Biden administration, what options do these people have for protecting themselves in the event that Trump decides to start getting serious about this?
Well, some of that depends on whether or not members of the staff of the January 6th committee are still in government or if they have moved on into private employment. If you are a government worker, if you are a civil servant, there are generally protections provided for you. If you are non-political,
Right.
if you are not a political appointee, then there are workplace protections for you. However, that does not mean that you are completely protected from harassment and intimidation, right, and investigations. And if you are working in the private sector, I think some of it depends on kind of who your current employer is.
Right.
And for many of these people that worked on the committee, many of them were lawyers and some of them have moved on to work with private law firms. So for them, they might have the resources to push back or resist any attempts to intimidate or harass them or try to prosecute them for whatever. But for others that may, have gone on to work for whatever private company, I think there is a real possibility that if they are threatened with, harassment or investigation by law enforcement or even kind of prosecution and indictments, there's the real possibility that they wouldn't have the resources, right, or even kind of to speak plainly, the money, right, to pay for a legal defense to push up back against this.
Right.
So some of it just depends on their current situation. And it also depends on kind of which levers of power that Trump and his administration officials decide to use to persecute someone. So, yeah, there's a lot of variables at play there.
Right, right. I know you've spent a ton of time putting together a very detailed visualization of the Capitol riot participants and the connections between them, and we'll go ahead and link that in the show notes. Can you tell us about how you got started doing this kind of data visualization and how you've applied that skill set to this project?
Right. So I started the Capitol riot map about 3.5 years ago. And initially, it was in the months following the Capitol riot after several hundred people had been arrested. and charged with participation for various crimes, I was trying to kind of figure out a way to kind of wrap my head around who all these people were, how they were connected to various far right groups, what kind of commonalities maybe they had. And so I just initially decided to do a simple visualization where I just took all the names of the people that had been arrested and charged and connected them all through the Capitol riot, the singular event. And then from then built it out, adding additional pieces of information and connecting them to the various far right extremist groups or conspiracy theory networks such as QAnon. And it was just initially just a way for me to understand it and kind of be able to share that kind of data in a visual way that allowed people to kind of understand just how kind of massive a thing this was. I think when numbers get kind of that large, when you have, several hundred to, now more than 1,500 people that have been arrested and charged, I think for most people it's difficult to kind of wrap your head around. And so when you have that kind of visualization, I think it gives people a better understanding of what exactly it is, how many, just the breadth and depth of how many people are involved and how many connections there were. So that was the basics of it. And I initially didn't begin the project with any intent to like, I never expected that I would still be working on it and developing it 3 years later, but here
Yeah.
we are. And I think recently it's become even kind of more urgent for me to kind of um, make it as complete as possible and update it as much as possible, considering that, Donald Trump is coming back into office and that, as we talked about earlier, there's a high likelihood that many of these people that are kind of on this map maybe getting pardons, and that whatever evidence that was gathered by the committee or other law enforcement may be purged and kind of disappeared by the administration. So
Right. So I noticed that you shared an article a few days ago on your timeline from Salon by Griffin Eckstein about how so many of the companies that condemned the January 6th insurrection are now lining up to give Trump money for the inauguration, as are people like Mark Zuckerberg from Meta, formerly known as Facebook. And he goes into detail in the article about how Trump has threatened to punish any company that gets on his bad side. So it seems like these businesses have kind of read the writing on the wall and decided that it's go along to get along time. We saw also how people who contributed large sums of money to the inauguration in 2017 ended up receiving plum political jobs. People like Louis DeJoy, who later got appointed Postmaster General by Trump. Can you think of anything that's just been more blatantly corrupt in American political history? Because I can't.
well, I would probably have to go back to maybe the late 1800s, kind of Gilded Age.
Right. Teapot Dome, maybe something along
Yeah.
those lines.
I cannot think of anything within recent history that has been kind of this blatant pay for play kind of corruption. And it really stands in stark relief when you think about the days and weeks after January 6th, how you had so many of these different companies and CEOs of corporations who made a big public display about their position on what happened and their opposition to Donald Trump and his role in the Capitol riot.
Right.
And not simply that, but many of them made pledges and made the decision to no longer donate to the campaigns of any Republicans who
We're involved in this. Yeah.
who supported the big lie or who voted to not certify the 2020 election.
Mm-hmm.
And then over time, after months and years, Many of those people eventually kind of went back on some of those promises, and the money kind of started flowing back to a lot of those Republican lawmakers. And now we're at the point where you have all these people that make these kind of big displays of virtue signals, right? Who have kind of completely flipped. And to use a kind of a popular term that I've seen a lot online, have kind of, what is it, acquiesce or
Obeyed in advance, I think, is what you're looking for here.
obeyed in advance, right? This kind of,
Yeah.
and to some extent, I don't think people should find it that surprising, though, especially when you're talking about people like Mark Zuckerberg and kind of people within the tech industry and other really wealthy people within other industries, because I think they view Trump rightly as just a very transactional individual, and they understand that to avoid any kind of problems with his administration or to avoid being kind of a target of his ire, it's really simple. You know, if they give $1 million to his inauguration fund or promise to donate money to whatever one of his ventures, visit him in Mar-a-Lago, say nice things about him in the press, that's really all they have to do, because I think Trump over and over again has really kind of reinforced the fact that he is very transactional in nature, and he
Yes.
doesn't have necessarily a real kind of firm ideological worldview, right? And so I think in some ways they are obeying in advance, but in other ways they're just kind of doing what wealthy people have always done, right? Is try to buy and exert influence in whatever way they can.
Right. Maximizing shareholder value, as it were.
Right, right. And so, and we'll see how that plays out over time. I think, especially when you talk about kind of Trump's most prominent and wealthy supporter, Elon Musk, we'll see how that relationship plays out over time.
Right.
Because the other piece of Trump's nature that we've come to kind of understand, in addition to him being very transactional, he doesn't share very well and doesn't share the spotlight. And I think
No.
the real question is whether or not he's going to appreciate kind of
Yeah.
not only kind of the idea that Musk is the kind of power behind the throne, as it were, but the how it's become kind of memified online, right?
Yeah.
Trump sees those things, and so that's going to be a question moving forward too.
And Elon has definitely not been shy about giving the impression, especially in the last month or so, that he is that power behind the throne, that he's going to do most of what he wants, and Trump is kind of there to facilitate that. And it's interesting because there is a fault line in that now. You start to see people like Steve Bannon who are starting to push back on that. They've realized that a lot of the base simply just isn't going to go for the things that Elon wants, things like H-1B visas. And Bannon is a pretty savvy political infighter, has been for a while. And he's learned a few things from 2017 when he lost one to Kushner. So you can see the seeds being set for Bannon starting to make noise about how Musk doesn't really represent MAGA. And that's going to be an interesting civil war going over there to keep your eye on, to see how that ends up playing out in the final analysis.
Yeah, I think that's going to be one of the biggest kind of variables in determining how effective Trump and officials within his administration will be able to not just pursue the policy goals that they want to pursue, but also kind of exact this kind of revenge fantasy that they want, and target people in the way that they want. Is these this kind of constantly shifting coalition that brought him into power is in some ways held together with like matchsticks and gum. I mean, as
Yeah.
we're speaking, the House of Representatives is voting on who is going to be the next speaker, and there's no guarantee it's going to be Mike Johnson again.
Right. As of right now, he doesn't have the votes. They're still on the first vote.
Right.
but he doesn't have the votes right now. He's 3 short of what he would need.
Yeah. And so that's going to be a real hindrance, right? Is
Right.
because, and I think we saw this play out during the Trump 1.0, during the first Trump administration, is that the levers of power and how Congress and the government operates in itself is a hindrance to kind of the various authoritarian tendencies of Trump. And so it's going to be interesting to see what happens moving forward because unfortunately for Trump, is that his base of supporters, particularly kind of the far right MAGA faithful, are not patient and they do not take to kind of excuses like, well, Congress is in gridlock and I can't get the Republican House to do what I want. And so that's going to lead to kind of friction, more friction and infighting. So kind of, I think it might end up being that the biggest hindrance to MAGA getting what they want will be MAGA itself, right? So.
Oh, yeah. They cannot get out of their own way. And this is going to be really, really interesting to see if they've got the political discipline to elect, the speaker that everybody seems to think is going to end up getting it at some point, or if they're going to turn him into Kevin McCarthy 2.0 and just humiliate him again in front of the world. I can't really see what the point of this is from their perspective, but, they obviously seem to think they have one. So here we are.
The only other thing I would add to that is that the one thing that does bring the MAGA base together and that Republicans are good at kind of rallying around is a scapegoat, right?
Right.
And so it's going to be incumbent on people to kind of keep a watchful eye and be vigilant about who the next marginalized group will be that will be targeted, right? Whether it's seen immigrants are probably the kind of first in line to be targeted. There's already been a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric coming into office. Trans folks, whether it's other queer folks, other people of color, other marginalized communities. If there's one thing that brings that MAGA base together, it's focusing their ire on some marginalized community.
Yeah.
And so the real challenge is to be kind of watchful on who the next targets are. And also, I think holding the media accountable from kind of falling into those narratives and being used as a way to kind of promote the narratives that they have sought to promote. So that's going to be the other kind of aspect of all this.
Right. So how can people support you and the work you're doing?
Yeah, the easiest way to support my work is to subscribe to my newsletter. I have free and paid versions. If you go to radicalreports.org, you can subscribe to my newsletter there and get all of my updates and dispatches on what's going on with the far right and extremist movement. And you can follow me everywhere on social media. Most of what I've been posting these days has been on Blue Sky, where you can find me there at Report by Wilson.
Yeah, it definitely seems like everything has moved from Twitter over to Blue Sky in terms of everybody that's, not a groiper, not a full-on MAGA person, seems to have just up and pulled stakes. So if you're looking for some of the people that you may have lost track of and you're on Twitter, you should really go over and look at Blue Sky because everybody's pretty much there and moving somewhat more happily on with life.
I'm now at the point where I'm kind of surprised now when somebody isn't on Blue Sky and is still on Twitter or somewhere else. So yeah, I would definitely recommend coming over to Blue Sky. I think it's not without its problems. There's still, trolls and kind of bots and things, but the kind of moderation tools and the way that the community deals with kind of the space is much better than any other social media platform I've been a part of. So yeah.
Right. It does seem like it's stepped up and taken the mantle of the Twitter alternative that people have been crying out for, especially since Elon bought the platform. And Twitter has just gotten absolutely worse. It's one thing to stick around if you're somebody like Teddy or myself, who spends a lot of time monitoring these people and kind of has to pay attention to what they're doing. It's another thing altogether if that's not your job and this isn't something that somehow makes your life better. If you don't have to watch all of this, then I would highly recommend maybe going over to Blue Sky or somewhere else and not having to feed yourself a daily diet of this, because, man, it's gotten worse. It's just gotten worse. Teddy, thanks again for coming on. I really appreciate having you on. This is going to be a great article. When's it drop? When do you publish?
I'll be publishing it Sunday afternoon.
Sunday afternoon.
At about 12 p.m. Eastern time.
Nice. So by the time you're listening to this, the article should be out. Go over to radicalreports.com, sign up for a membership, and you will not regret it. Teddy's one of the more consistent and sane voices on this side of things. So if you're not already reading his content, please make sure that you get that rectified as soon as you can.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me on again, Griff. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Did Nothing Wrong podcast. If you want to hear more, you can find us on the web at didnothingwrongpod.com. Please make sure you subscribe to get our content straight into your inbox. You can also follow us on Twitter at GrizaBJJ, GRZABJJ, as well as DNWPod. We're extremely grateful for paid subscriptions and donations that allow us to keep doing this important work. Thanks, and remember, everyone mentioned did nothing wrong.